So, the first thing we need to talk about is the pledge. What is this object that has to be made to disappear in our lives? Well, I want to call it the sacred object. And the sacred object, at its most basic, is any object that you believe will bring wholeness and completeness, certainty and satisfaction to your life. Now, in order to understand why this sacred object exists, I want to start with the story of Oedipus. In the story, as many of you know, Oedipus wants to sleep with his mother. Now, he doesn't know it's his mother, but it is. His father gets in the way, and so he kills his father, sleeps with his mother, and this is a disaster. Now, one of the ways of understanding this story is to see the mother as a type of return to oceanic oneness, a return to the womb, a return to wholeness. And the father is a type of prohibition that prevents that gets in the way of you returning to that oneness, that completeness. So Oedipus wants to break through the prohibition and become whole and complete. Basically, this is a cautionary tale that says that we should be careful about getting what we want. Only when we fulfill our dreams do we realize that our dreams do not fulfill us. This is why Charlie and the Chocolate Factory should probably have been done as a horror film rather than as a children's film. You have basically a type of devil character tormenting these kids in a great warehouse, promising them everything they could ever possibly want. And so at the end, when Charlie is there, having won the competition, Willy Wonka looks at him and says, "Don't forget what happened to the man who got everything he ever wanted." And Charlie said, "What happened?" And then Willy Wonka breaks out in a big smile, an evil grin, and says, "Well, he lived happily ever after." Now, those words might not sound too horrific at first, but if we turn to an old episode of The Twilight Zone, it might become clearer. In this episode called A Nice Place to Visit, this guy called Rocky Valentine, who is a low-level criminal, is robbing a jewelry store when he's shot by the police. Rocky wakes up right where he fell, and there's no bullet holes on him. And standing over him is this guy in a white suit called Pip. Pip welcomes him. Well, Rocky Valentine gets his gun out, says to Pip, "Give me all your money." And Pip laughs. He says, "Money? If you want money, I'll give you money. I'll give you as much money as you want. Come with me." And Pip brings him to this incredible mansion with lots of money. And Valentine's beginning to work out that something isn't quite right. He's realizing that actually this is the afterlife. Well, Rocky starts to wonder why he's getting all of this money and why he's getting this mansion when really all he's ever been is a criminal. But he doesn't ask too many questions, and he goes and he gambles with Pip. And every game he plays, he wins. After a whole night of gambling, Pip says to him, "Listen, I'm away, but if you ever need me, pick up the phone and I'll be here." Well, days turn into weeks and weeks into months, and eventually Rocky Valentine is pulling his hair out. It's just too much. So he picks up the phone and Pip arrives. And Pip says, "What's wrong?" And Rocky Valentine says, "I get everything I want." Pip says, "Yeah, absolutely." And he says, "Well, I hate it." He says, "I can't lose at the poker table." And then Pip brings out a book and says, "Well, how many times would you like to lose? I can make that happen." And Rocky's like, "No, no, no." He says, I just don't want to be here. I shouldn't even be in heaven. I wasn't even a good guy." And of course, Pip turns around to him, starts to laugh and says, "Whatever made you think you were in heaven? This is hell." And as he laughs, you hear the voiceover saying that Rocky Valentine is condemned to live happily ever after. Now, the reason why getting what we want can be so traumatic is expressed beautifully by Freud when he talks about the difference between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The pleasure principle just names our desire for things. When you're a kid, you want to climb trees. You want to eat chocolate all day. You want to win all the games that you play. That's pleasure principle. And reality principle, well, that's all the things that get in the way of those. So you want to climb trees, but your body won't let you. You want to eat chocolate all day, but your parents won't let you. You want to win all the games that you play, but your friends won't let you. Now, we tend to think that the reality principle gets in the way of the pleasure principle. If only we could get rid of the reality principle, then we could have everything that we want. What Freud realized is it's actually the reality principle that causes pleasure. If we were to be able to climb Everest as soon as we wanted to, it would take all the pleasure out of it. There is something about distance and struggle that generates desire. But the problem is, as resistance and reality makes more of an impact, it can generate an excessive desire for something beyond it. And when this reaches its zenith, the sacred object comes into the picture. The sacred object is basically that thing that seems to promise so much precisely because we cannot get it. Now, this is beautifully captured in the Bible. At the very beginning of the text, we have an Oedipal story. It describes the human condition beautifully. We have Adam and Eve walking around a garden, not dissatisfied at all, until a prohibition enters. A prohibition that says you cannot eat of that fruit tree. Now, in this story, you have a serpent. And the serpent is a type of superego. So for Freud, one of the things that causes so much dissatisfaction for us is that there is this voice that is always telling us that if only we had more or did more, then everything would be good. You should have more friends. You should be more successful. You should be going out more. You should be having more sex. You should be nicer to your parents. Whatever it is, the superego is always saying you should, you should, you should. And we think that if we obey this voice, we will find happiness. But the more we give in to this voice, the more unhappy and anxious we are. Well, this voice is the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve. It is the voice that says, if you eat of this fruit tree, you will be like God. In other words, you will lack the lack. You will be whole and complete. You will be satisfied. And so now Adam and Eve are unhappy. They break through the prohibition. They get the fruit. They think it's going to be a blessing, but it's a curse. So the question is, why do some objects become sacred for us? Why does some mundane object take on such significance that we think if only we grabbed it, everything would be wonderful? Well, the simple answer is, it's the prohibition itself. The more you prohibit something, the more you desire to transgress the prohibition and get the object. We see this all the time with children. If you say to a kid they can't have something, often that will make the object even more desirable, to such an extent that they feel if only they could have that, they would need nothing else. The more we say no, the more the no generates a desire for what's beyond it. We can see this in the phrase making love. Originally, two people didn't make love. You needed a third person to make love. And the third person was a chaperone. The idea was that two people would go out on a date and a chaperone would accompany them. Now today we think that the role of the chaperone is to stop the two people from doing anything untoward. But no, the role of the chaperone was to create a prohibition so that the two people would begin to fantasize about what they could do if only the chaperone wasn't there to stop it. And we see an example of this in America when they created a technology to help young people have sex. Now, this wasn't the conscious reason for it, but it definitely was one of the results. In a society where most things are allowed, they needed some sort of prohibition. So you have the existence of the purity ring. People put the purity ring on to say that they won't have sex, but the result is to make sex sexual again, to make them want it. So then, the sacred object only exists insofar as it's prohibited, and once we grasp it, we end up grasping nothing. This is beautifully described by the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who takes the example of fossils within creationism. For some creationists, they believe that God put fossils in the world to make it look old. So a fossil doesn't actually have an original animal to which it's connected. And Zizek said this is what this sacred object is like. When we finally grasp the thing that we want, we are simply left with a fossil. And it's a fossil that has no corresponding reality. It's the fossil of something that doesn't actually exist. So Zizek defines it like this. He says the sacred object has every perfection except one: existence. In other words, it's omnipotent, omniscient, it promises everything. And the only perfection it doesn't have is that it doesn't actually exist. Now, this means that we can only ever take three positions towards the sacred object. One is we can fantasize that someone is stopping us from getting it. Now, this is the basic definition of fascism. The fascist community believes in organic wholeness and oneness, but there is some group that is stopping that. It's the figure of the Jew. If only they got rid of the Jewish community, then everything could be whole and complete. And they do not realize that actually they rely on the figure of the Jew. It's the Jewish community that holds them together. Their shared hatred of that group is what keeps them unified. If they were to get rid of that group, they would then simply discover their own internal crisis. The second position you can take is to fantasize that someone else has the sacred object that you don't. You get jealous of those who are around you, who seem to have the perfect life that you don't, and you want what they have, so much so that you can end up hating them, wanting to destroy them. Or thirdly, we pretend to have the sacred object because we enjoy the substitute pleasure of the fantasy that other people think we have it. We put out a perfect life on social media, enjoying how people are envious of us, how people want what we have. And all of these positions basically end up causing all of the suffering and the struggles and the difficulties that are specifically human. So finally, I just want to say one thing about how this lack is felt in our lives. You see, there's two types of nothingness in life. There's a type of nothingness that is nothing, and there's a type of nothingness that is something. For example, the nothingness before you were born is nothing. You don't care about it. But the nothingness that awaits you after death can cause you anxiety. Just like there's a difference between not speaking because you have nothing to say and not speaking because you have something to say. Or a phone not ringing when you're not expecting it to. Or a phone not ringing when you are. There are types of nothingness that are nothing to us, and there are types of nothingness that are incredibly significant to us. And this lack is incredibly significant. It is incredibly destructive. And so what I want to look at in the next session is how do we free ourselves from this sacred object? And how do we free ourselves from this debt that we feel in the very core of our being?